everyone. Thank you so much for joining in to the final edition of So What Live for 2021. Wrapping up Philippians. You got Ken May along with the skipper, Jason Price. I surmise we will revisit this format again at some point in 2022, but we're putting a bow on Philippians. So any questions you have, please send them in through the chat, or any highlights that you have from the series. We'd love to hear about it, so it doesn't have to be contained to just this weekend. So I hope you remember what you talked about, 9 weeks ago.
Well, I would love to hear. Just let's make this as interactive as we can. We know most people watch this after it's recorded, so that's unhelpful.
Yes.
But drop it in the chat. It'll be on there forever, right? We can see it later. But I'd just love to hear, what is the thing that God's taught you through this series? What's a takeaway, or how has God spoke to you, or what's something that you're going to do or be different because of our study through Philippians? So make this interactive. That's the whole point of us doing it live. So jump in.
I'll tell you, one of the things that stood out to me was from Philippi. It wasn't from the book of Philippians, but all the way back in week 1 with the Philippian jailer. Now, we have no idea what happened to him after that, but for a guard working for Caesar to declare that Jesus is Lord, which means now Caesar isn't.
Yeah.
And the courage that it took for him and his whole family to lay down their allegiance to Jesus and not Caesar, to me is remarkable, and I hope to meet him one day.
Yeah, it's a cool part of the story. And again, there's so much to this series. Like we could have done easily another 3 or 4 weeks. I didn't even get to touch on the last part in chapter 4, verse 22, where it says, "All God's people here send you greetings, especially those who belong to Caesar's household." So Paul is in chains in Rome, and yet his testimony is impacting people all the way up into Caesar's household. This is Nero in power at that time. And there were people in Caesar's household who's come to faith because of presumably Paul's ministry there in Rome. It's just so remarkable.
And if I'm not mistaken, isn't Nero purported to be one of the most wicked of the Caesars?
Yeah. He was
Rome burned when Nero fiddled, something like Nero.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know, are there some highlights from this series for you? And when you get engrossed in the text, all the stuff that you had to leave out?
Yeah.
Or does it all kind of blur for you, or do you have any highlights for us?
It is a bit of a blur. Like you said, some of it was 9 weeks ago. But I think just going back through it again, the whole point, or one of the main points of this whole text is found back in chapter 1, where he is encouraging, there's got to be a stronger word, imploring, compelling his audience to live in a manner worthy of the gospel. That's what he says. Conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. And then he says, whether I come to you or I don't come to you, whatever happens to me, it won't matter. I will know at that point that you stand firm in one spirit, contending together as one for the gospel. So that coming back to that picture of unity in the church, together, conducting ourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. Does our lives show that the gospel is glorious? Does our lives show that our Savior is worth sacrificing ourselves for?
So I remember that passage in the old NIV, the 84, doesn't, it says, whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner where the gospel, the newer version, whatever happens to me.
Yeah.
But that whole idea, no matter what happens around us, to behave in a manner worthy of Jesus. Yeah. And the first thing that comes to mind is gossip. Yeah. Like, cut that business out. Yeah. People, especially the faithful, should not be engaging in gossip, because that's not worthy. That doesn't help our testimony any.
Yeah. And there's so many other. His big one is being unified. Stand together. Lay down your life. I mean, again, that was the weekend we told the story of the 21 guys who were martyred. They lived a life. Their death showed Jesus as worthy of their life.
Well, I don't know if it was that sermon, but I have a note here from week 3. It's how we handle suffering speaks volumes about Jesus.
Yeah.
Are we bemoaning our suffering, or are we trusting in our suffering? That has an evangelistic bent to it. Even if we suffer well, it says something about the one that we
The
serve.
worthiness of the one you're suffering for.
Yes. So I've had 2 different questions come in this week.
Okay.
Let's see. One was based on the sermon, and so I'll just go. This one's from Rick Bird, and here we go. I'll give it to you as he gave it to me. It says, in Philippians, Paul emphasized his posture of contentment in any and every circumstance. We Americans seem to worship the God of comfort. Perhaps Pastor Jason would like to distinguish the two.
Rick, you said?
Yes,
Rick.
And it's Bird with a U, not an I.
Rick, you are 100% right. We do worship at the altar of comfort. One of the things that has been instilled into my soul over about the last 3 years, actually, I'll take it back a little further than that, probably back to 2016, is that we have such a terrible theology of suffering. Just terrible. Our theology in the American church of suffering is that when we suffer, it means God isn't there or God doesn't care. That's our theology of suffering. If something bad happens in my life, my first response is, where are you, God? God must not be there. I can't not believe in a God, but I do believe that God doesn't care.
That one's probably easier.
Yeah.
I believe in God, but God is off distant.
That's right. So God doesn't care. Because again, if he was loving, if he was good, if he was kind, if he was holy, if he was righteous, if he is all powerful, he would do something to change my situation. But he just doesn't care. So that's our theology, I believe, in the American church of suffering. God isn't there or God doesn't care. And you're 100% right. It is a terrible theology because that bumps up against our worship of comfort. It bumps up against it. So when my suffering comes, it wrecks my idol of comfort. And so I have to figure out how to make that work. So Rick, I would encourage you and anybody else as you're thinking about this, I actually did an entire series talking about suffering. So if you want to kind of get a behind the scenes peek at what I think about suffering, I did a whole series, and I just pulled it up before, because he shared that question with me. I pulled it up right before we came on, and I taught that series in the fall of 2019.
Right before the pandemic comes.
Isn't that hilarious how that worked out? We had no idea what we were walking into.
Divine timing.
The fall of 2019, I did a series called... what did I call it?
To this you were called.
To this you were called. And it was a series out of 1 Peter. And whether you know it or not, 1 Peter is all about suffering. In fact, I think that word is used somewhere around 13 times in that 5-chapter book. It's all about suffering. And that phrase, to this you were called, the end of that verse is, to this you were called, to suffer like Jesus suffered. That's the context of that verse. We'll get to it as you go through the series. But I would highly encourage you to go back and listen to that. I think it started in September of 2019. If you go to our website and click on our messages tab, you can click the tab by series. You can actually search all of our sermons by series. Just go down to this you were called, and we do a whole sermon series addressing this issue of suffering.
That was a good series, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect because it was preparatory for what was to come.
Yeah.
So now we have another question here from John Latier, and he quotes Philippians 4:17. It says, "Not that I desire your gifts. What I desire is more be credited to your account." So, hey, thanks that you gave me what you gave me. I didn't really need it. God took care of me, but you should get credit for this. He asked, he said, can you elaborate on this credit and also like what eternal rewards might be?
I won't elaborate on what the eternal rewards might be because I don't know. Scripture gives us a couple little hints, but I don't even like to speculate on that. But I do just want to reaffirm that idea. Again, we see it here that, hey, what you gave to me got credited to your account. We saw it when I referenced 1 Timothy chapter 6, where Paul says, you can send it ahead. Like when you give, command them to be generous and willing to share. And in this way, they're laying up treasure for themselves, not treasure for others. You're saving it for yourself when you give it away. I mean, I don't know how all that works, but it's biblical. But both of these instances are just sharing another teaching of Jesus. So it goes back to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6. So Jesus is the one who started this whole idea of sending it ahead, of somehow laying up your treasure in heaven by what you do with your resources here. So this is Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, your heart will be also. And then he goes into a teaching about the eye is the lamp of the body. And if your eye's well, and that word eye, it's actually even in the footnote of my Bible, the Greek there, if your eyes are healthy, the text says, and in the footnote it says, the Greek word here implies generous. If your eye is healthy, your body will be full of light. If your eyes are unhealthy, and then my footnote says, the Greek for unhealthy here implies stingy. So if you're generous, if you're healthy, your whole body's full of light. If you're stingy, your life is full of darkness. That's the context there. Therefore, verse 25, therefore being the connecting word, back still talking about generosity and treasures in heaven versus treasures on earth. Therefore, don't worry about your life, what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink, what you're going to wear. God takes care of the birds. He'll take care of you. He dresses the flowers of the field. They're better than Solomon. So don't worry about all of that stuff. Verse 31. So don't worry saying, what will we eat? What will we drink? What shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things. Your heavenly Father knows what you need. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these will be given to you as well. That verse is in the context of generosity. Seek first the kingdom, and all of the other stuff that you're needing will be supplied to you, which is exactly the same thing that Paul taught in our text. He says, look, thank you for giving me what you gave me. Thank you for being generous, and my God will supply all of your needs. Now, what's interesting about that, and again, this is the stuff I didn't get to preach, so I'm going to do another sermon today. When they gave, they literally gave till they had need. And I don't think we recognize this. You don't see it here in Philippians. But if
they gave until they were now in need.
That is correct. And how do we know that? Well, because Paul says it in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, 8. Paul's writing to the Corinthian church, and he's talking about the offering that they're trying to collect there in the Corinthian church. And here's what he says. Now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. So Paul's in Corinth, and he's talking about the Macedonian churches, which the Philippi is in Macedonia. Again, go back to all the way to week 1. Remember, Paul was in Asia Minor. He was in what we call modern-day Turkey, and he got a vision from the man from Macedonia. That's right. Come visit us. Come share the gospel. And God called Paul to Macedonia. And where was the first city he ended up in Macedonia?
Philippi.
So he goes and he says, I want you to hear about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify, Paul raised his hand, put it on the Bible. I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. They gave beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. They exceeded our expectation. They gave of themselves, first of all, to the Lord, and then, by the will of God, also to us. So they gave beyond their ability. They put themselves in hardship for the sake of giving to Paul and the work of the ministry. So when Paul writes there in the end of Philippians, my God will supply all of your needs. That had to come as not just some kind of platitude for them, but as a promise, because out of their overwhelming generosity, they gave beyond their ability. And Paul says, don't worry about that. That was a fragrant offering to God, and he will supply what you need. Maybe not all you want. You're not getting the Benz.
Right.
But he'll supply all you need.
And I think of the amount of faith that takes. It reminds me of the widow's mite, right? Taking her 2 coins, and all she had. She put all she had to live on.
And that is what I believe is credited to their account. It wasn't just the amount of money, because you are 100% right. When Jesus was sitting there at the temple courts looking at the offerings, it says many rich people came and dumped in bucket loads of money, and Jesus yawned because he says they gave out of their excess. They had more than enough left over. But she, and Jesus says, she put all she had to live on. She gave out sacrificially as an act of faith. It took faith in God to give all and that got Jesus to his feet, called his disciples over and says, do you see that woman? That's what God's looking for. So it was not just about that amount of money. It was about the sacrifice that was proven by that amount of money. Her faith put into practice by her giving.
And that takes me back to, I think, with Rick's comment, comfort. We don't want to put ourselves in a position of need. And I get the wisdom, right?
Sure.
You don't want to reap the edges of your field, but I'd be hard pressed to do that.
Yeah.
That 100% would I be hard pressed to do that. My account might not have as much in it when I get there. So I have a question based on your sermon from this past Sunday about being content in any and every situation. That's pretty remarkable, but I think there's a way to have a healthy discontent. And what I mean by that is without a desire to have better, be better, get better, do better, we don't get things like penicillin or the wheel or the internet or any type of advancement. So, but I don't want to, I'm not dismissing what Paul said, so I'm hoping that you could help us. I'm thinking of help us determine the difference between I have a healthy discontent that wants to grow or make something better, and I'm just discontent or ungrateful or unfaithful or lack faith.
So I wonder if there is a way to distinguish being a discontent in the physical realm versus the spiritual realm. And I don't know if there's a good answer, but what you're talking about is progress, right? That I want to figure out a faster way to get to work, or a better job for my family, or a more efficient way to do whatever. Sure, I think progress is good. I don't think that's at all what Paul's trying to talk about when he's talking about being content in any and every circumstance. He's talking about trusting God no matter what. So if I want to seek a more efficient way to build the whatever gadget that I'm trying to build for my factory, that's progress. So I can be discontent with this loss and try to keep getting more efficient, but that doesn't have any bearing on my soul. And if I get there, then great. If I don't get there, great. I can be content whether or not I ever find a more efficient.
I think you just said it. Yeah, I want this thing to get better, but if it doesn't, I'll be okay.
Right.
Like it doesn't affect my faith.
That's what Paul's trying to address. He says, I'm good if it's better. I'm good if it stays bad. I'm good if it's in want. I'm good if I have plenty. And so there's a trusting in God no matter what. Being thankful to God no matter what. We talked about it in staff meeting this week, right? Ephesians 5:20. Be thankful in all circumstances. In all circumstances, all of them. So, yes, moving, progress, building, growth, we should all desire that, and that should drive us to do better, get better. But at the end of it, we're going to trust God no matter what happens. We're going to keep believing God no matter what happens. We're going to keep being faithful to the Lord no matter what happens. We're going to be content that God is sovereign over those things no matter what, and my faith is not going to be shaken. Whether things are great or things are bad, I'm going to be content with where God has me. So I think you can have both. I think you can strive for progress and be content if it never comes.
Yeah, that's helpful for, I think, of the people who are ambitious for whatever endeavor, but to know, okay, I'm still anchored to this faith.
Yeah.
And even if my ambition doesn't come to fruition, I can be content because I have what I need in Jesus.
That's right.
So during our So What Live here, we had a little internet glitch, so we didn't get a lot of comments through the chat. We got like one, hey, thanks, guys. So people, most of this will be viewed later. I don't know if you have any last words you want to give before we wrap it up and say goodbye or happy Thanksgiving. Or
Yeah, I'd just say thanks for joining us through this. I hope that our time in Philippians was fruitful for you. Again, we love walking through books of the Bible like this, and we hope that it blesses you and your family. So that's it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. I imagine you're watching this later in light of our glitch, but have a great Thanksgiving. Thank you so much for joining us for So What Live. We'll see you this Sunday. Have a great week.